Crime and Punishment, Part 2, Subsection 7. In the middle of the street stood a jaunty, high-class carriage, harnessed to a pair of fiery grey horses. There were no passengers, and the coachman, having climbed down from his box, was standing by. The horses were being held by their bridles. A great many people were crowding around, the police in front of them all. One of them was holding a lantern and bending down, directing light at something on the pavement just by the wheels. Everyone was talking, shouting, gasping. The coachman looked bewildered and kept repeating every so often, "What a shame, Lord, what a shame." Raskolnikov pushed his way through as well as he could, and finally glimpsed the object of this bustle and curiosity. A man just run over by the horses was lying on the ground, apparently unconscious, very poorly dressed, but in gentleman's clothes, and all covered with blood. Blood was flowing from his face, from his head. His face was all battered, scraped, and mangled. One could see that he had been run over in earnest. "Saints alive!" wailed the coachman. "How could I help it? If I'd been racing, or I hadn't hollered to him, but I was driving at a slow, steady pace. Everybody saw it, as true as I'm standing here. A drunk can't see straight. Who doesn't know that? I saw him crossing the street, reeling, nearly falling over. I shouted once, then again, then a third time, and then I reined in the horses. But he fell right under the feet. Their feet. Maybe on purpose, or else he was really so drunk. The horses are sick, are young, skittish. They reared up. He gave a shout, they took off again, and so we came to grief." "That's exactly how it was," some witness responded from the crowd. "He did shout, it's true, he shouted 3 times to him," another voice responded. 3 times exactly, everybody heard it," cried a third. The coachman, however, was not very distressed or frightened. One could see that the carriage belonged to a wealthy and important owner, who was awaiting its arrival somewhere. How to see this last circumstance was no small part of the policeman's concern. The trampled man had to be removed to the police station and then to the hospital. No one knew his name. Meanwhile, Raskolnikov pushed ahead and bent down closer. Suddenly, the lantern shone brightly on the unfortunate man's face. He recognized him. I know him, he cried, pushing all the way to the front. "He's an official, a retired official, a titular councillor, Marmeladov. He lives near here, in Kozel's house. Our doctor, quickly! Here, I'll pay." He pulled the money from his pocket and showed it to the policeman. He was surprisingly excited. The police were pleased to have found out who the trampled man was. Raskolnikov gave his own name and address as well, and began doing his utmost to persuade them, as if it were a matter of his own father, to transport the unconscious Marmeladov to his lodgings. "It's here, 3 houses away," he urged. "The house belongs to Kozel, a German, a rich man. He must have been trying to get home just now, drunk. I know him. He's a drunkard. He has a family, a wife, children. There's a daughter. I'll take too long to bring him to the hospital, and I'm sure there's a doctor there in the house. I'll pay. Anyway, they'll take care of him. They'll help him at once. Otherwise, he'll die before he gets to the hospital." He even managed to slip them something unobserved. It was, however, a clear and lawful case, and in any event, help was closer here. The trampled man was picked up and carried. People lent a hand. Kozel's house was about 30 steps away. Raskolnikov walked behind, carefully supporting the head and showing the way. This way. Carry him head first up the stairs. Turn him around. There, I'll pay. I'll thank you well for it," he muttered. Katerina Ivanovna, as soon as she had a free moment, would immediately begin pacing her small room, from window to stove and back, her arms crossed tightly on her chest, talking to herself and coughing. Lately, she had begun talking more and more often to her older daughter, the 10-year-old Polenka, who, though she understood little as yet, still understood very well that her mother needed her, and therefore always followed her with her big, intelligent eyes, and used all her Guile, to pretend that she understood everything. This time, Polenka was undressing her little brother, who had not been feeling very well all day, getting him ready for bed. The boy, waiting for her to change his shirt, which was to be washed the same night, was sitting silently on the chair, with a serious mien, M-I-E-N, straight-backed and motionless, his legs stretched out in front of him, pressed together, heels to the public and toes apart. He was listening to what his mamma was saying to his sister, with pouting lips and wide-open eyes, sitting perfectly still, as all smart little boys ought to do when they are being undressed for bed. The even smaller girl, in complete rags, stood by the screen waiting her turn. The door to the stairs was open, to afford at least some protection from the waves of tobacco smoke that issued from the other rooms, and kept sending the poor consumptive woman into long and painful fits of coughing. Katerina Ivanovna seemed to have grown even thinner over the past week, and the flushed spots on her cheeks burned even brighter than before. You wouldn't believe, you can't imagine, Polenka, she was saying, pacing the room. How great was the gaiety and splendor of our life in Papa's house, and how this drunkard has ruined me and will ruin you all. Father had the state rank of colonel, and was nearly a governor by then. He only had one more step to go, so that everyone called on him used to say, "Even now, Ivan Mikhailovich, we regard you as our governor." When I, oh, curse this life, she exclaimed, coughing up phlegm and clutching her chest. At the marshal's last ball, when Princess Bezemelny saw me, the one who blessed me afterwards when I was marrying your father, Polya, she asked me once, "Isn't that nice young lady who danced with the shawl at the graduation? That rib should be mended. Why don't you take the needle and darn it now, the way I taught you, otherwise tomorrow it'll tear worse," she cried, straining herself. At that same time, a kammerjunker, Prince Shegolsky, had just come from Petersburg. He danced a mazurka with me, and the very next day wanted to come with a proposal, but I thanked him personally in flattering terms, and said that my heart had belonged to another. The other was your father, Polya. Papa was terribly cross with me. "Is the water ready? Now, give me the shirt. And the stockings. Lida," she turned to the little daughter, "you'll just have to sleep without your shirt tonight, somehow, and lay out your stockings too, so they can be washed together. Why doesn't that ragtag come home, the drunkard? He's worn his shirt out like some old dustcloth. It's all torn. I could wash it with the rest and not have to suffer 2 nights in a row. Lord!" "Again, what's this?" she cried out, looking at the crowd in the entryway and people squeezing into her room with some burden. "What's this? What are they carrying? Lord! Is there somewhere to put him?" the policeman asked, looking around, with the blood-stained and unconscious Marmeladov had already been lugged into the room. "On the sofa! Lay him on the sofa! Head this way!" Raskolnikov pointed. "Run over in the street, drunk!" someone shouted from the entryway. Katerina Ivanovna stood all pale, breathing with difficulty. The children were completely frightened. Little Lidochka cried out, rushing to Polenka, threw her arms around her, and began shaking all over. Having laid Marmeladov down, Raskolnikov rushed to Katerina Ivanovna. "For God's sake, calm yourself. Don't be afraid." He spoke in a quick patter. "He was crossing the street and was run over by a carriage. Don't worry, he'll come around. I told them to bring him here. I was here once. You remember. He'll come around. I'll pay." "He finally got it," Katerina Ivanovna cried desperately, and rushed to her husband. Raskolnikov quickly noted that she was not one of those women who immediately fall into a faint. Instantly there was a pillow under the unfortunate man's head, something no one had thought of yet. Katerina Ivanovna began undressing him, examining him, fussing over him, not losing her presence of mind, forgetting herself, biting her trembling lips, and suppressing the cries that were about to burst from her breast. Raskolnikov meanwhile persuaded someone to run and get a doctor. As it turned out, there was a doctor living 2 houses away. "I sent for a doctor," he kept saying to Katerina Ivanovna. "Don't worry, I'll pay. Is there any water? And bring a napkin, a towel, something quickly. We don't know yet what his injuries are. He's been injured, not killed. Rest assured, the doctor will say." Katerina Ivanovna rushed to the window. There, on a broken seated chair in the corner, a big clay bowl full of water had been set up, ready for the nighttime washing of her children's and husband's linen. This nighttime washing was done by Katerina Ivanovna herself, with her own hands, at least twice a week and sometimes more often, for it had reached a point where they no longer had any changes of linen, Each member of the family had only one, and Katerina Ivanovna, who could not bear uncleanliness, preferred to wear herself out at night and beyond her strength, while everyone was asleep, so that laundry would have time to dry on the line by morning, and she could give them all clean things, rather than to see dirt in the house. She tried to lift the bowl and bring it over, as Raskolnikov had requested, but almost fell with the burden. But he had already managed to find a towel, and he wet it and began washing Marmeladov's blood-stained face. Katerina Ivanovna stood right there, painfully catching her breath and clutching her chest with her hands. She herself was in need of help. Raskolnikov began to realize that he had perhaps not done well in persuading them to bring the trampled man there. The policeman also stood perplexed. "Polya!" Katerina Ivanovna cried. "Run to Sonia, quickly! If you don't find her there, never mind, tell them that her father has been run over by a carriage, and that she should come here at once, as soon as she gets back. Quickly, Polya! Here, put on a kerchief." "Run fast as you can," the boy suddenly cried from his chair, and having said it, relapsed into his former silent, straight-backed sitting, wide-eyed, heels together, toes apart. Meanwhile, the room had become so crowded that there was no space for an apple to fall. The police had left, except for one who stayed for a time and tried to chase the public thronging in from the stairs back out to the stairs again. In their stead, almost all of Mr. Lipoweshel's tenants came pouring from the inner rooms, crowding in the doorway at first, but then flooding into the room itself. Katerina Ivanovna flew into a rage. "You might at least let him die in peace," she shouted at the whole crowd. "A fine show you found yourself, with cigarettes! Maybe with your hats on too. Really, there's one in a hat. Out! At least have some respect for a dead body." Coughing stopped her breath, but the tongue lashing had its effect. Obviously, Katerina Ivanovna even inspired some fear. The tenants, one by one, squeezed back through the door, with the strange feeling of inner satisfaction which can always be observed, even in those who are near and dear, when a sudden disaster befalls their neighbor, and which is to be found in all men, without exception, however sincere their feelings of sympathy and commiseration. Outside the door, however, voices were raised about the hospital, and how one ought not to disturb people unnecessarily. So one ought not to die, cried Katerina Ivanovna, and she rushed for the door, to loose a blast of thunder at them. But in the doorway she ran into Mrs. Lipoweshel herself, who had just managed to learn of the accident and came running to re-establish order. She was an extremely cantankerous and disorderly German woman. "Ach, my God!" She clasped her hands. "Your drunken husband has a horse trampled. To the hospital with him. I am the landlady. Amelia Ludwigovna, I ask you to consider what you are saying," Katerina Ivanovna began haughtily. She always spoke in a haughty tone with the landlady, so that she would remember her place, and even know she could not deny herself the pleasure. Amelia Ludwigovna, I have told you how many times before that you must never dare say to me, Amal Ludwigovna, I am Amal Ivan. You are not Amal Ivan, you are Amelia Ludwigovna, and since I am not one of your base flatterers, like Mr. Lepzinyatnikov, who is now laughing outside the door there was indeed laughter, and someone cried, "A cat fight," I shall always address you as Amelia Ludwigovna, though I decidedly fail to understand why you dislike this appellation. You see for yourself what has happened to Semyon Zakharovich. He is dying. I ask you to close this door at once and not allow anyone in. Let him at least die in peace. Otherwise, I assure you, tomorrow your action will be made known to the Governor General himself. The prince knew me as a young girl, and very well remembers Semyon Zakharovich, to whom he has shown favor many times. Everyone knows that Semyon Zakharovich had many friends and protectors, whom he himself abandoned out of noble pride, aware of his unfortunate weakness. But now," she pointed to Raskolnikov, "we are being helped by a magnanimous young man who has means and connections, and whom Semyon Zakharovich knew as a child, and rest assured, Amelia Ludwigovna, All this was spoken in a rapid patter, faster and faster, but coughing all at once interrupted Katerina Ivanovna's eloquence. At that moment the dying man came to and moaned, and she ran to him. He opened his eyes and still, without recognition or understanding, began peering at Raskolnikov, who was standing over him. He breathed heavily, deeply, rarely. Blood oozed from the corners of his mouth. Sweat stood out on his forehead. Not recognizing Raskolnikov, he began looking around anxiously. Katerina Ivanovna looked at him sadly but sternly, and tears flowed from her eyes. "My God, his whole chest is crushed, and the blood, so much blood," she said in despair. "We must take all his outer clothes off. Turn over, little Semyon Zakharovich, if you can," she cried to him. Marmeladov recognized her. "A priest," he said in a hoarse voice. Katerina Ivanovna went over to the window, leaned her forehead against the window frame, and exclaimed in desperation, "Oh, curse this life! A priest!" the dying man said again after a moment's silence. This is very depressing. Jesus Christ. "They've gone!" Katerina Ivanovna cried at him. He obeyed the cry and fell silent. He was seeking for her with timid, anguished eyes. She went back to him and stood by his head. He calmed down somewhat, but not for long. Soon his eyes rested on little Lidochka, his favorite, who was shaking in the corner as if in a fit and stared at him with her astonished, childishly attentive eyes. He pointed to her worriedly. He wanted to say something. "What now?" cried Katerina Ivanovna. "Barefoot! Barefoot!" he muttered, pointing to the crazed eyes at the girl's bare little feet. "Be quiet!" Katerina Ivanovna cried irritably. "You know very well why she's barefoot." "Thank God! The doctor!" Raskolnikov cried joyfully. The doctor came in, a trim little old man, a German, looking about him with mistrustful eyes. He went over to the sick man, took his pulse, carefully felt his head, and with Katerina Ivanovna's help, unbuttoned his shirt, all soaked with blood, and bared the sick man's chest. His whole chest was torn, mangled, mutilated. Several ribs on the right side were broken. On the left side, just over the heart, there was a large, ominous, yellowish black spot, the cruel blow of a hoof. Ugh. The doctor frowned. The policeman told him that the injured man had been caught in a wheel and dragged, turning about 30 paces along the pavement. "It's surprising that he recovered consciousness at all," the doctor whispered softly to Raskolnikov. "What is your opinion?" the latter asked. "He will die now." "There's no hope at all?" "Not the slightest. He is at his last gasp. Besides, his head is dangerously injured. I could perhaps let some blood, but it would be no use. In 5 or 10 minutes he will certainly die." Try letting some blood then." "Perhaps. However, I warn you it will be perfectly useless." At that point more steps were heard. The crowd in the entryway parted, and a priest, a grey-haired old man, appeared on the threshold with the holy gifts. A policeman had gone to fetch him while they were still in the street. The doctor immediately gave way to him, and they exchanged meaningful glances. Raskolnikov persuaded the doctor to stay at least for a little while. The doctor shrugged and stayed. Everyone stepped aside. The confession lasted a very short time. The dying man probably did not understand much of anything, and he could utter only abrupt, inarticulate sounds. Katerina Ivanovna took Lidochka, got the boy down from his chair, went to the corner near the stove, knelt, and made the children kneel in front of her. The little girl went on shaking, but the boy, upright on his bare little knees, raised his hands regularly, making a full sign of the cross, and bowed to the ground, bumping with his forehead, which seemed to give him special pleasure. Katerina Ivanovna was biting her lips and holding back her tears. She, too, was praying, straightening the boy's shirt from time to time, and she managed to throw her kerchief over the girl's bare shoulders, taking it from the top of the chest of drawers as she prayed and without getting up from her knees. Meanwhile, curious people began opening the door from the inner rooms again, and more spectators, tenants from all down the stairs, crowded into the entryway, but without crossing the threshold. The whole scene was lighted by just one candle end. At that moment, Polenka, who had run to fetch her sister, squeezed quickly through the crowd in the entryway. She came in, almost breathless from running hard, took off her kerchief, sought out her mother with her eyes, went to her and said, "She's coming. I met her in the street." Her mother pulled her down and made her kneel beside her. Timidly and inaudibly, a girl came in, squeezing through the crowd, and her sudden appearance was strange in that room, in the midst of poverty, rags, death, and despair. She, too, was in rags, a two-penny costume, but adorned in street fashion, to suit the taste and rules established in that very special world, with a clearly and shamefully explicit purpose. Sonia stood in the entryway, just at the threshold, but not crossing it, with a lost look, unconscious, as it seemed, of everything, forgetting her gaudy silk dress, with its long and absurd train, bought at front bought at fourth hand and so unseemly here, and her boundless crinoline that blocked the entire doorway, and her light-colored shoes, and the little parasol, useless at night, which she still carried with her, and her absurd round straw hat with its flame-colored feather. From under his hat, cocked at a boyish angle, from under this hat, cocked at a boyish angle, peered a thin, pale, and frightened little face, mouth open and eyes fixed in terror. Sonia was of small stature, about 18 years old, thin but quite pretty, blonde and with remarkable blue eyes. She stared at the bed, at the priest. She, too, was breathless from walking quickly. Finally, certain whispered words from the crowd probably reached her. She looked down, took a step over the threshold, and stood in the room, though still just by the door. Confession and communion were over. Katerina Ivanovna again went up to her husband's bed. The priest withdrew, and he was leaving, to try to address a few words of admonition and comfort to Katerina Ivanovna. "And what am I to do with these?" she interrupted sharply and irritably, pointing to the little ones. "God is merciful. Hope for help from the Almighty," the priest began. "Ugh! Merciful, but not to us. That is sinful, madam, sinful," the priest observed, shaking his head. "And this is not sinful?" cried Katerina Ivanovna, pointing to the dying man. "Perhaps those who were the inadvertent cause will agree to compensate you, at least for the loss of income." "You don't understand," Katerina Ivanovna cried irritably, waving her hand. "What is there to compensate? He was drunk. He went and got under those horses himself. And what income? There wasn't any income from him. There was only torment. The drunkard drank up everything. He stole from us and took it to the pot-house. He wasted their lives and mine in the pot-house. Thank God he's dying. We'll have fewer losses. You would do better to forgive him in the hour of death. Such feelings are a sin, madam, a great sin." Katerina Ivanovna was bustling around the sick man, giving him water, wiping the sweat and blood from his head, straightening his pillow as she talked with the priest, and only turned to him from time to time while doing other things. But now she suddenly fell upon him almost in a frenzy. Father! Words, nothing but words. Forgive him, and what if he didn't get run over? He'd come home drunk, wearing his only shirt, all dirty and ragged, and flop down and snore, and I'd be sloshing in the water till dawn, washing his and the children's rags, and then I'd hang them out the window to dry, and as soon as it was dawn, I'd sit down right away to mend them. That's my night. So what's all this talk about forgiveness? As if I hadn't forgiven him. Deep, terrible coughing interrupted her words. She spat into her handkerchief and thrust it out for the priest to see, holding her other hand to her chest in pain. The handkerchief was all bloody. The priest hung his head and said nothing. Marmeladov was in his final agony. He would not take his eyes from the face of Katerina Ivanovna, who again bent over him. He kept wanting to say something to her. He tried again, moving his tongue with effort and uttering in unintelligible words. But Katerina Ivanovna, understanding that he wanted to ask her forgiveness, at once shouted at him peremptorily, "Be quiet! Don't! I know what you want to say." And the sick man fell silent, but at the same moment his wandering eyes rested on the doorway, and he saw Sonia. He had not noticed her until then. She was standing in the corner, in the shadows. "Who's there? Who's there?" he said suddenly, in a hoarse, breathless voice, all alarmed, in horror, motioning with his eyes towards the doorway, where his daughter stood, and making an effort to raise himself. Lie down, cried Katerina Ivanovna. But with an unnatural effort he managed to prop himself on one arm. He gazed wildly and fixedly at his daughter for some time, as though he did not recognize her. And indeed, he had never seen her in such attire. All at once he recognized her, humiliated, crushed, bedizened, Bedizzened, and ashamed, humbly waiting her turn to take leave of her dying father. Infinite suffering showed in his face. Sonia, daughter, forgive me, he cried, and tried to hold out his hand to her, but without its support he slipped from the sofa and went crashing face down on the floor. They rushed to pick him up, laid him out again, but by then he was almost gone. Sonia cried out weakly, ran and embraced him, and remained so in that embrace. He died in her arms. So he got it, Katerina Ivanovna cried, looking at her husband's corpse. Well, what now? How am I going to bury him? And how am I going to feed them tomorrow? All of them. Raskolnikov went up to Katerina Ivanovna. Katerina Ivanovna, he began, last week your deceased husband told me all about his life and his circumstances. You may be sure that he spoke of you with rapturous respect. Since that evening, when I learned how devoted he was to all of you, and how he respected and loved you especially, Katerina Ivanovna, in spite of his unfortunate weakness, since that evening we became friends. Permit me now to assist, to pay what is due to my deceased friend. Here are 20 rubles, I think, and if this can serve to help you, then in short, I'll come again. I'll be sure to come, maybe even tomorrow. Goodbye. And he quickly left the room, hastening to squeeze through the crowd and reach the stairs. But in the crowd he suddenly ran into Nikodym Fomitch, who had learned of the accident and wished to take a personal hand in the arrangements. They had not seen each other since that scene in the office, but Nikodym Fomitch recognized him instantly. Ah, it's you, he asked. He's dead, Raskolnikov answered. The doctor was here, a priest was here, everything's in order. Don't trouble the poor woman too much. She's consumptive, as it is. Cheer her up with something, if you can. You're a kind man, I know, he added with a smirk, looking him straight in the eye. But really, you're all soaked with blood, Nikodym Fomitch remarked, making out by light of the lantern several fresh spots of blood on Raskolnikov's waistcoat. Soaked, yes, I've got blood all over me, Raskolnikov said, with some peculiar look. Then he smiled, nodded his head, and went down the stairs. He went down slowly, unhurriedly, all in a fever, and filled, though he was not aware of it, with a new, boundless sensation of a sudden influx of full and powerful life. This sensation might be likened to the sensation of a man condemned to death, who is suddenly and unexpectedly granted a pardon. Halfway down he was overtaken by the priest on his way home. Raskolnikov silently let him pass, exchanging wordless bows with him. But as he was going down the last few steps, he suddenly heard hurried footsteps behind him. Someone was running after him. It was Polenka. She was running after him and calling, "Listen, listen!" He turned to her. She ran down the last flight and stopped very close to him, just one step higher. A dim light came from the courtyard. Raskolnikov made out the girl's thin but dear little face, smiling and looking at him with childish cheerfulness. She had come running with an errand, which apparently pleased her very much. "Listen, what is your name? And also, where do you live?" she asked hurriedly in a breathless little voice. He put his two hands on her shoulders and looked at her with something like happiness. It gave him such pleasure to look at her, he did not know why himself. "Who sent you?" "My sister Sonia sent me," the girl replied, smiling even more cheerfully. "I just knew it was your sister Sonia." "Mama sent me too. When my sister Sonia was sending me, Mama also came over and said, 'Run quickly, Polenka.' Do you love your sister, Sonia?" "I love her most of all," Polenka said with some special firmness, and her smile suddenly became more serious. "And will you love me?" What? Anyhow, instead of an answer, he saw the girl's little face coming towards him, her full little lips naively puckered to kiss him. Suddenly her arms, thin as matchsticks, held him hard. Her head bent to his shoulder, and the girl began crying softly, pressing her face harder and harder against him. "I'm sorry for Papa," she said after a minute, raising her tear-stained face and wiping away the tears with her hands. With so many misfortunes lately, she added unexpectedly, with that especially solemn look children try so hard to assume when they suddenly want to talk like big people. And did Papa love you? He loved Lidochka most of all, she went on, very seriously, and no longer smiling, just the way big people speak. He loved her because she's little and because she's sick, and he always brought her treats, and us he taught to read, and me he taught grammar and catechism, she added with dignity. And Mama didn't say anything, but we still knew she liked that, and Papa knew it. And Mama wants to teach me French, because it's time I got my education. And do you know how to pray? Oh, of course we do. Since long ago, I pray to myself, because I'm big now. And Kolya and Lidochka pray out loud with Mother. First, they recite the Hail Mary, and then another prayer. God forgive and bless our sister Sonia. And then God forgive and bless our other Papa, because our old Papa died already, and this one is the other one. But we pray for that one too. Polechka, my name is Rodion. Pray for me too, sometimes. And for the servant of God, Rodion. That's all. I'll pray for you all the rest of my life, the girl said ardently, and suddenly laughed again, rushed to him, and again held him hard. Raskolnikov told her his name, gave her the address, and promised to come the next day without fail. The girl went away completely delighted with him. It was past 10 when he walked out to the street. 5 minutes later he was standing on the bridge, in exactly the same spot from which the woman had thrown herself not long before. Enough, he said resolutely and solemnly. Away with the mirages, away with the false fears, away with spectres. There is life. Was I not alive just now? My life hasn't died with the old crone. May the Lord remember her in his kingdom. And enough, my dear, it's time to go. Now it's the kingdom of reason and light, and will and strength, and now we shall see. Now we shall cross swords, he added presumptuously, as if addressing some dark force and challenging it. And I had already consented to live on a square foot of space. I'm very weak at the moment, but all my illness seems to have gone, and I knew it would when I went out today. By the way, Pachinkov's house is just 2 steps away. Razumikin's now. Certainly, even if it weren't 2 steps away. Let him win the bet. Let him have his laugh. It's nothing. Let him. Strength. What's needed is strength. Without strength, you get nowhere, and strength is acquired by strength. That's something they don't know, he added proudly and self-confidently, and he left the bridge barely able to move his legs. Pride and self-confidence were growing in him every moment. With each succeeding moment, he was no longer the man he had been the moment before. What special thing was it, however, that had so turned him around? He himself did not know. Like a man clutching at a straw, he suddenly fancied that he, too, could live, that there still was life, that his life had not died with the old crone. It was perhaps a rather hasty conclusion, but he was not thinking of that. I did ask her to remember the servant of God, Rodion, however, suddenly flashed in his head. Well, but that was just in case, he added, and laughed at once at his own schoolboy joke. He was in excellent spirits. He had no trouble finding Razumikin. The new tenant of Pochinkov's house was already known, and the caretaker immediately showed him the way. From halfway up the stairs one could already hear the noise and animated conversation of a large gathering. The door to the stairs was wide open. Shouts and arguing could be heard. Razumikin's room was quite big, and about 15 people were gathered in it. Raskolnikov stopped in the anteroom. There, behind a partition, 2 of the landlady's serving girls busied themselves with 2 big samovars, bottles, plates, and platters with pies and hors d'oeuvres brought from the landlady's kitchen. Raskolnikov asked for Razumikin. He came running out, delighted. One could tell at a glance that he had drunk an unusual amount, and though Razumikin was almost incapable of getting really drunk, this time the effect was somewhat noticeable. Listen, Raskolnikov hurried. I only came to tell you that you've won the bet, and that indeed nobody knows what may happen to him. But I can't come in. I'm so weak, I'm about to fall over. So hello and goodbye. Come and see me tomorrow. You know what? I'm going to take you home, if you yourself say you're so weak then. What about your guest? Who's that curly one who just peeked out here? Hmm, devil knows. Must be some acquaintance of my uncle's, or maybe he came on his own. I'll leave my uncle with them, a most invaluable man. Too bad you can't meet him right now. But devil take them all away. They've forgotten about me now, and besides, I need some cooling off, because you came just in time, brother. Another 2 minutes, and I'd have started a fight in there, by God. They pour out such drivel. You can't imagine to what extent a man can finally get himself wrapped up in lies. But why can't you imagine it? Don't we lie ourselves? Let them lie, then. And afterwards they won't lie. Sit down for a minute. I'll get Zazimov. Zazimov fell upon Raskolnikov even with a sort of greediness. Some special curiosity could be seen in him. Soon his face brightened. To bed without delay, he decided, having examined the patient as well as he could. And take a bit of something for the night, will you? I've already prepared it. A little powder. Or two, even, Raskolnikov replied. The powder was taken at once. It will be very good if you go with him, Zazimov remarked to Razumikin. Well, we'll see what may happen tomorrow, but today it's not bad at all. Quite a change from this morning. Live and learn. You know what Zazimov whispered to me just now as we were leaving? Razumikin blurted out as soon as they stepped into the street. I'll tell you everything straight out, brother, because they are fools. Zazimov told me to chat you up on the way and get you to chat back, and then tell him because he's got this idea that you're mad or close to it. Imagine that. First, you're 3 times smarter than he is. Second, if you're not crazy, you'll spit on him having such drivel in his head. And third, this hunk of meat, a surgeon by profession, has now gone crazy over mental illnesses. And what finally turned him around about you was your conversation today with Zamyatov. Zamyatov told you everything? Everything, and it's an excellent thing he did. I now understand it all inside and out. Zamyatov understands it too. Well, in short, Rodya, the point is, I'm a bit drunk now, but that doesn't matter. The point is that this notion, you understand, was really hatching in them. You understand? That is, none of them dare to stick. That is, none of them dare to say it out loud because it's the most absurd drivel, and especially once they picked up the house painter, it all popped and went out forever. But how can they be such fools? I gave Samyatov a bit of beating then. That's between us, brother. Don't let out even a hint that you know. I've even noticed he's touchy. It was at Lavitsa's. But today it all became clear. This Ilya Petrovich, mainly. He took advantage of your fainting in the office that time, but afterwards he felt ashamed of it. Ashamed himself. That I know. Raskolnikov listened greedily. Razumikin was drunk and telling all. I fainted that time because it was stuffy and smelled of oil paint, Raskolnikov said. He keeps explaining, and it wasn't only the paint. That inflammation had been coming on for a whole month. Zazimov is here to testify. But how mortified the boy is now, you can't even imagine. I'm not worth his little finger, he says, meaning yours. He occasionally has decent feelings, brother, but the lesson today in the Crystal Palace, that stops them all. You really scared him at first, nearly drove him to convulsions. You really almost convinced him again about all that hideous nonsense, and then suddenly stuck your tongue out at him. Take that. Perfect. Now he's crushed. Destroyed. By God, you're an expert. It serves them right. Too bad I wasn't there. He's been waiting terribly for you now. Porfiry also wants to make your acquaintance. Ah, him too. And why have I been put down as mad? Well, not mad exactly. It seems I've been spouting off too much, brother. You see, it struck him today that you were interested, only in just that one point. Now it's clear why you were interested, knowing all the circumstances, and how it irritated you then, and got tangled up with your illness. I'm a little drunk, brother. Only devil knows about him. He's got some idea in his head. I tell you, he's gone crazy over mental illnesses. But you can spit. They were silent for half a minute or so. Listen, Razumikin, Raskolnikov started to say, I want to tell you straight out. I'm just coming from a dead man's house, some official who died. I gave them all my money, and besides, I was just kissed by a being who, even if I had killed someone, would still, in short, I saw nothing being there, too, with a flame-colored feather. But I'm getting confused. I'm very weak. Hold me up. Here's the stairs. What is it? Asked the alarmed Razumikin. I'm a little dizzy, only that's not the point. But I feel so sad. Like a woman, really. Look, what's that? Look. What? Do you see? A light in my room, see? Through the crack. They were standing before the light the last flight, next to the landlady's door, and looking up, one could indeed see that there was light in Raskolnikov's closet. Strange. Nastasia, maybe, observed Razumikin. She never comes to my room at this hour. Besides, she's long been asleep. But I don't care. Farewell. But what is it? I'll take you up. We'll go in together. I know we'll go in together, but I want to shake your hand there and say farewell to you here. So give me your hand and farewell. What's got into you, Rodia? Nothing. Let's go. You'll be a witness. They began climbing the stairs, and the thought flashed through Razumikin's mind that Zazimov might be right after all. I upset him with all my babbling, he muttered to himself. Suddenly, coming to the door, they heard voices in the room. What's going on here? Razumikin cried out. Raskolnikov took the door first and flung it wide open. Flung it open and stood rooted to the threshold. His mother and sister were sitting on the sofa, and had already been waiting there for an hour and a half. Why was it that he had expected them least of all, and had thought of them least of all, even in spite of the earlier repeated news that they had left, were on their way, would arrive any moment? For the entire hour and a half they had been vying with each other in questioning Nastasia, who was standing before them even now and had managed to tell them the whole story backwards and forwards. They were beside themselves with fear with what they heard that he ran away today, sick and, as appeared from the story, certainly delirious. God, what's become of him? They both wept. They both endured the agony of the cross during that hour and a half of waiting. A cry of rapturous joy greeted Raskolnikov's appearance. Both women rushed to him. But he stood still like a dead man. A sudden, unbearable awareness struck him like a thunderbolt, and his arms would not rise to embrace them. They could not. His mother and sister hugged him tightly, kissed him, laughed, wept. He took a step, swayed, and collapsed on the floor in a faint. Alarm, cries of terror, moans. Razumikin, who was standing on the threshold, flew into the room, took the sick man up in his powerful arms, and in an instant had him lying on the sofa. It's nothing, he cried to the mother and sister. He's just fainted. It's all rubbish. The doctor just said he was much better, completely well. Water! See, he's already recovering. See, he's come to. And grabbing Danetchka's arm so hard that he almost twisted it, he bent her down to see how he's already come to. The mother and sister both looked upon Razumikin with tenderness and gratitude, as on Providence itself. They had already heard from Nastasia what he had been for Rodia throughout his illness. This efficient young man, as he was referred to that same evening, in an intimate conversation with Danya, by Pulcheria Alexandrovna Raskolnikov herself.